It's remarkable that The Bachelor has made it to its 30th season. For those unfamiliar with the premise, the show centers around a single eligible bachelor or bachelorette who is introduced to a group of 20 suitors. The entire courtship, complete with reality show style challenges and competitions for various advantages, is filmed and edited to create the most engaging storyline for viewers. Unfortunately, this format inevitably undermines the relationship itself. To avoid spoilers, the winner is kept in isolation from their newfound love until the entire season has aired, which only exacerbates the situation. Edited for maximum drama, the show forces the winner to watch their once cherished moments unravel as they are presented with footage of the lead character vacillating between two choices. To make matters worse, the winner is forced to endure the sight of the other contestants engaging in intimate moments with the bachelor during the fantasy suites. I can't help but think how, despite all the manufactured drama of the modern dating shows, the outcome still seems predictable. The leads, torn between multiple contestants, often leave us wondering how true connections can survive such theatrics. Yet, in a way, this formula is nothing new in the world of love and courtship. History, too, offers its fair share of similarly swift, albeit more consequential romantic decisions. Take, for example, King Henry VIII, who, after the shocking and dramatic downfall of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, wasted little time in moving on. A mere day after the executioner lifted the Queen's head for the crowd to see her lips finish their final prayer, King Henry was engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 10 days, they were celebrating their marriage. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I. Episode number 3, The Wicked Stepmothers. Although Elizabeth had finally entered this tangled tale, she was still far from the main character in her own story. Her father, Henry VIII, still commanded center stage, dictating who could be a part of his daughter's world. The first of a line of stepmothers to enter the scene was Jane Seymour. With calculated grace, the 27-year-old noble had orchestrated her rise with flawless precision. Embedded within Anne Boleyn's entourage, Jane vowed to give Henry the world, but only on the condition that they wed. Her rise was fueled by a faction intent on reinstating Catholicism and a noble family that swiftly secured top positions in Henry's government. Their immediate focus was on dismantling the influence of Anne's uncle, the formidable Thomas Howard. The king bypassed his privy council entirely, announcing his engagement on the very day that his previous marriage ended at the executioner's blade. Henry's council likely breathed a sigh of relief. His previous daughters had been cast aside in the line of succession, leaving Jane Seymour with the crucial task of delivering England a legitimate heir. At the age of 44, Henry VIII was hardly the young, virile monarch he once was. What raised more eyebrows, however, was Jane Seymour's age, as royal marriages in Tudor times were often arranged for girls much younger, sometimes as early as 12. Facts like this hardly mattered, however, as Henry was in love, and when he fell for someone, he fell hard. Historian Alison Weir reveals to us that it was not Jane's face that attracted the king so much as the fact that she was Anne Boleyn's opposite in every way. Where Anne had been bold and fond of having her own way, Jane showed herself entirely subservient to Henry's will. Where Anne had, in the king's view, been a wanton, Jane had shown herself to be inviolably chaste. Where Anne had been ruthless, he believed Jane to be naturally compassionate. He would in years to come remember her as the fairest, most discreet, and the most meritorious of his wives. However, Jane's compassion didn't extend to everyone. She worked quickly to reinstate Mary as the rightful heir, albeit temporarily, until she and Henry could provide a male successor. Mary, who had faced cruelty during Anne's reign, was given a reprieve. Weir notes that 7 years of insecurity and misery had made her a martyr. At 20, to headaches, menstrual problems, and nervous depression, as well as vague, ill-defined illnesses. And she was grieving her mother. Ignoring the tragic lessons of the past, Henry subjected Elizabeth to the same fate that had emotionally destroyed her half-sister. The 3-year-old was taken to Hatfield in order to remain unseen. Mary's sudden reversal in fate allowed her to partake in the lavish wedding celebrations, which were grand in every sense. However, with the royal coffers near depletion, Henry could not justify the expense of a new coronation for his queen. Just 2 weeks after Jane's coronation, Mary finally conceded, signing documents that not only acknowledged her father as the head of the Church of England, but also affirmed her understanding that her parents' marriage had been invalid due to her mother's prior union with Henry's brother. Later, when history would dub her Bloody Mary, she would come to deeply regret the betrayal of her late mother. Jane was a stickler for protocol. As the Queen of England, only a handful of court members held a high enough station to interact with her personally. Despite their 7-year age difference, Mary quickly became both a friend and companion of Jane. A new family dynamic began to take root, with the king finally showing affection to his daughter for the first time in 6 years. On her birthday, she received a diamond ring from her stepmother, while her joyful father bestowed 1,000 crowns upon her. For a girl who had lived in abject poverty just a year earlier, Mary's head must have been spinning. Jane, however, barely acknowledged Elizabeth, a 3-year-old whose mother had just been executed by her father's command. The absence of her mother, coupled with the arrival of a new stepmother, would surely have prompted questions in a 3-year-old's mind. While we don't know exactly how Elizabeth learned of Anne's death, it's clear it had a deeply traumatic impact on the toddler. Banished from her father's presence, Elizabeth's caregivers were left frustrated as they watched her quickly outgrow her clothing. Without the king's permission, her household was unable to purchase the basic necessities of life. Elizabeth's fate might have mirrored that of Mary's, if not for her half-sister, who took it upon herself to ensure that Elizabeth's household had what it needed. She visited often, and once her position was settled, became Elizabeth's most devoted advocate at court. Mary's status as heir was formally reinstated when the newlywed couple failed to conceive a child right away. With his advancing age and growing health problems, much of the blame was placed on Henry. However, despite these setbacks, he remained deeply in love with his third wife. Jane, however, soon realized that even Henry's affections had their limits during the Pilgrimage of Grace. The residents of Lincolnshire rose in rebellion after Henry's men had taken axes to stained-glass windows, sacred vestments, and holy shrines in their efforts to purge the Church of England of anything considered popish. Jane, a devout Catholic, suggested to her husband that the rebellion might be God's punishment for the wanton destruction of churches during Anne Boleyn's reforms. Jane, well aware of the battles he fought with her predecessor, was nonetheless shocked when the brunt of his anger was aimed at her. He even had the nerve to remind her that his last queen had died as the result of meddling too deeply into politics. The lesson was not lost on Jane, who from that moment on refrained from any political intervention. 6 months into their lawful marriage, the entire family came together to celebrate Christmas at the Windsor. Henry, softened by the warmth of the occasion, was observed smiling and playing with Elizabeth. Soon after, Jane discovered she was expecting. The world seemed to stop as the couple turned their attention entirely to the longed-for male heir. The king, caught up in the excitement of the pregnancy, went to great lengths to indulge Jane's cravings, including an absurd number of quails. It seemed as though he, too, was affected by Cuvier syndrome, eating 12 quails at dinner and another dozen at supper, fully immersed in the shared experience. Weir teaches that a year on the throne had transformed Jane into a pious and godly matron who was fully conscious of her rank and dignity, and who carried the knowledge that she might well be nurturing the heir to England in her womb. Jane's labor, which endured for an agonizing 3 days and nights, was fraught with complications. But at the end of it came Edward, the boy that Catherine and Anne had failed to deliver. The Tower of London shot off more than 2,000 rounds of ammunition to honor the occasion. The Tower of London erupted into celebration, firing over 2,000 rounds of ammunition in honor of the occasion. Elizabeth, among others at court, attended the grand christening just 3 days later. But just as quickly as the joy had arrived, it was tempered by the Queen's sudden illness the following day. For women in the 16th century, childbirth was a deadly gamble, and Jane's experience was tragically no different. It's likely that Jane tore her perineum during childbirth, leading to an infection, most probably due to midwives neglecting to properly clean their hands before assisting with the delivery. 9 days later, with the sacrament of last rites given, the Queen of England peacefully passed away in her sleep. While it's claimed that Henry waited 2 years before naming a new wife out of respect for Jane, the reality was that the king was ready to marry again, even as he struggled with the guilt of losing her. After all, it had been Arthur, his elder brother, who had been meant to inherit the throne. Although Henry now had Edward as his heir, he still longed for a backup. Determined to make his 4th marriage his final one, Henry focused on getting it right. His chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated the charges against Anne Boleyn, was pushing him to consider political alliances in his next choice, suggesting that a marriage to the right woman could solidify crucial support for the crown. Unfortunately, Henry's previous history with matrimony complicated matters. Having invented a new faith to divorce one wife and behead her successor, the kings of Europe weren't exactly eager to send their daughters across the channel to marry him. Oblivious to the shadow his past cast, Henry turned his gaze towards a daughter from the French king's court. When his negotiators requested that Henry be granted time with each of the eligible daughters, the French diplomat replied sarcastically, "Perhaps, sire, you would like to try them one after the other and keep the one you found most agreeable." When informed, the King of France laughed at the suggestion, stating to the court that it seems they meant to do with women as with their geldings. collect a number, and trot them out to take which goes best. As that door shut, Henry became captivated by the portrait of Christina of Denmark, the Duchess of Milan. Yet, while everyone considered to be an impeccable beauty, she wasn't for Henry. As Weir tells us that he was growing fat and preferred bosom women, like Catherine and Jane had been, not slim ones like Anne Boleyn. "I am big in person and need a big wife," the king declared. Though he was inclined to follow his own desires, Henry put them aside for the nation's benefit, particularly as his old enemies, the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France, had united in alliance that had posed a serious threat to the Protestant kingdom. He attempted to quickly seal the deal for the Duchess, but was shocked to be rebuked by the 16-year-old, who told Henry's ambassador that they could not be wed because the King's Majesty was in so little space rid of the Queen's that she dare not trust his counsel, though she durst trust his Majesty, for her council suspected that his first wife was poisoned, that the second wife was innocently put to death, and the third lost for lack of keeping in her childbed. Cromwell proposed a third option, aligning with the powerful family in a fragmented Protestant kingdom of Germany. While this may seem like an obvious choice, keep in mind that Henry had changed virtually nothing regarding his personal religious practices. The Protestant Church of England, with the king at its head, was nominally Catholic in everything but obedience to the Pope. The Duke of Cleaves had 2 daughters available and was overjoyed at the king's interest. Unfortunately, he died before the negotiations could be concluded, leaving his son as his successor, who was considerably more doubtful of the alliance. When Henry's ambassadors complained that the eligible daughters were in clothes whose modesty made it impossible to assess their figures, the young duke furiously asked, "Would you see them naked?" In truth, however, a lot of drama could have been averted if Henry's men had been allowed to interact more fully with Anne of Cleves, who was destined to be the king's 4th wife. While acknowledging that such a thing would have been highly inappropriate for a woman of Anne's age, a 16th century princess had little autonomy. As an infant, Henry had Elizabeth exposed to the French ambassadors to spark interest for a future marriage proposal. Though the king's men didn't need to see the young lady in such a state, the modest attire popular to post-Reformation Germany left little of her figure visible beyond her eyes. Unable to commit to a match with someone he wasn't attracted to, Henry sought to back out of the agreement. It was at this point that the young Duke of Cleves consented to have his daughter's portrait painted as proof of her beauty. This is the point in the story where Thomas Cromwell's machinations take center stage. The royal advisor had personally concluded that a German alliance was in his best interest. He personally wrote to the king informing him that every man praiseth the beauty of said Lady Anne, as well for her face as her person, above all other ladies excellent. She as far excelleth the Duchess of Saxony as the golden sun excelleth the silver moon. Every man praiseth the good virtues and honesty with shamefacedness, which plainly appeareth in the gravity of her countenance. Weir notes that Cromwell was undoubtedly exaggerating what he had been told. Few had actually seen very much of Anne of Cleves' charms, for she was always well swathed in cumbersome clothing when she appeared in public, and such occasions were rare. Her upbringing had been very strict, and anything approaching frivolity had been frowned upon. Yet Cromwell had good reason to exaggerate. This match had been his idea from the first, and it was vitally important to him that it should be successfully concluded. It would not be an exaggeration to say that his whole future depended upon that. In many ways, the Protestant Reformation liberated women. Vatican teachings had instilled the belief in Christian women that their highest calling was to become wives and mothers who were subservient to their husbands in all things. Theologian Karen Stettina points out that Martin Luther's revolt granted women new opportunities to be educated, participate in the church and in the family, and share the gospel. Proclaiming the priesthood of all believers, he taught that men and women were equal before God and free to pursue their God-given vocational challenges, elevating the status of both the homemaker as well as the farmer in the field. She points out that whenever Luther used the phrase all Christians, he meant women as well as men. As part of his reforms, the Bible was translated into the local vernacular, allowing lay persons to read the good book for themselves. Unfortunately, the Bible contains a significant amount of gendered language. One of my least favorite passages is Deuteronomy 22, verse 5, which reads, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all that do so are an abomination unto the Lord thy God." Such passages contributed to the centuries-long prohibition against women wearing pants. While the Catholic Church wasn't exactly a feminist institution, Martin Luther also held many stereotypes about women, once stating, "The word and the works of God are quite clear. Women were made either to be wives or prostitutes. Men have broad chests, small narrow hips, and more understanding, while women have small narrow breasts and broad hips, so they should remain at home, sit still, keep house, and bear and raise children." Raised in the spirit of the Reformation, Anne's family never discussed sex with her. Unwilling to question the wisdom of her parents, she was completely ignorant as to how children were conceived. Given this was Henry's fourth marriage, Cromwell should have been mindful of the bride-to-be's lack of preparation for the marriage bed. However, having already committed to deceiving his king about her beauty, he was bound to continue the falsehoods regarding her appearance. The two Englishmen sent to assess her even took along Henry's personal court painter. In a quiet aside, Cromwell instructed the artist to make her as attractive as possible. Weir describes to us the work of the talented artist Hans Holbein, writing that the result was one of the most exquisite portrait miniatures ever painted. Anne smiles out demurely from an ivory frame carved to resemble a Tudor rose. Her complexion is clear, her gaze steady, her face delicately attractive. She wears a headdress in the Dutch style which conceals her hair, and a gown with heavily jeweled bodice. Everything about Anne's portrait proclaimed her dignity, breeding, and virtue, and when Henry VIII saw it, he made up his mind at once that this was the woman he wanted to marry. Once again, he fell hard, this time for the 16th century version of a photograph. He carried her portrait everywhere, frequently pausing to gaze at it, entranced by her beauty. Cromwell and the rising tide of Protestant influence in England eagerly fueled Henry's growing fantasy. Not even the knowledge that Anne couldn't speak English, had no interest in music, and lacked any sense of fashion could diminish the vision of her that Henry had created in his heart. The marriage was decided, and Anne's journey was soon arranged. The king planned a Christmas wedding, followed by 12 days of festivities, culminating in Anne's coronation at Westminster Abbey. She was delayed, however. first by the slow progress of the 263 attendants Henry had dispatched to secure his bride, and then by winter storms that hindered her from crossing the Channel. As she neared England, however, whispers began to circulate within the court, privately expressing doubts about whether Anne of Cleves was as attractive as her portrait had suggested. Lady Brown, the head of her new household staff, was the first to confirm Cromwell's deception. Weir tells us that when she was presented to Lady Anne, she could barely conceal her dismay, and later confided in a letter to her husband that Anne was wearing such dreadful clothes and was obviously the product of so gross an upbringing that everything about her was far discrepant from the king's highness' appetite. Distance had fueled Henry's obsession with his bride-to-be, but when he finally laid eyes on her, he was appalled. He kept his manners intact, but the stark contrast between Anne and her portrait left him speechless, even causing him to forget the furs he'd picked out with care. Almost immediately, he concluded that he could never grow to love her. Weir writes that she revolted him. She was so different from the image portrayed by Holbein and described by Cromwell that he felt betrayed, ill-used, and deceived. Even though he was 48, he threw a tantrum in front of his court, repeatedly muttering, "I like her not." When confronted with the deception, Cromwell tried to deflect blame, insisting that he had been misled by others. Clinging to a shred of the honor instilled in him as a child, Henry pressed on with the wedding arrangements, all the while ordering his Privy Council to re-examine the marriage contract for any possible escape route. Unfortunately for the king, no attractiveness clause could be found. Though Henry had once been willing to risk the Pope's wrath to divorce Catherine, he now deemed breaking an ironclad agreement with the Germans too great a risk. The alliance was essential for defending against his Catholic enemies. He admitted as much just days before he was to walk down the aisle, confirming that if it were not for fear of making a ruffle in the world and of driving her brother into the arms of the Emperor and the French king, I would not now marry her. But now it is too far gone, wherefore I am sorry. On January 6, 1540, the wedding proceeded as planned. Henry played the part of the dutiful groom, maintaining a cheerful front through the ceremony, mass, and wedding festivities. But in the bedchamber, where it mattered most, his mind proved an insurmountable obstacle, and the marriage remained unconsummated. Anne entered her wedding night with no preparation or guidance on what to expect. As Weir recounts, she had little idea of what to expect in the marriage bed, so she lay there while her new husband ran his hands all over her body and then, it must be assumed, rolled over and went to sleep, leaving her undoubtedly bewildered and embarrassed. History has had its fair share of strange and disastrous royal wedding nights. Catherine the Great's husband, Peter, passed out drunk on their first night, later preferring the company of toy soldiers in bed. The last Chinese emperor, Puyi, panicked at the sight of his bride, recalling, "I looked all around me and saw that everything was red. It all looked like melted red wax candle. I did not know whether to stand or sit." Louis XVI took 7.5 years to consummate his marriage to Marie Antoinette, while Frederick II of Prussia got through it quickly but sighed, "Thank God that is over." But no one had a worse first night than Attila the Hun. According to the chronicler Jordanes, after undressing, Attila playfully chased his bride, only to slam into the bedpost, rupture a blood vessel, and drop dead. Clearly, Henry VIII isn't the only monarch in history to have an awkward first night with a new bride. What sets him apart, however, is that he carried on the pretense for months. Anne remained blissfully unaware that anything was amiss until she confided in her maids, praising the king's kindness in private. "When he comes to bed, he kisseth me, and taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me good night, sweetheart. And in the morning kisseth me, and biddeth farewell, darling," she said in halting English. When her ladies-in-waiting pressed further, asking if she remained a maid, she replied, "How can I be a maid and sleep every night with the king?" Only when they explained the realities of marriage did realization dawn, her eyes widening in shock. Weir tells us that it is difficult now to pinpoint exactly what it was about Anne of Cleves that aroused so much distaste in the king. Henry was realist enough to accept that a monarch had to marry for the good of his realm, and that this might mean a union with someone with whom he might be ill-matched. Yet in this case, he professed to feel such revulsion that he was on the brink of putting his own needs before the benefit of the kingdom. A second portrait of Anne shows that she had a long pointed nose and heavy-lidded eyes. Figure-wise, her tall stature may well have made her seem ungainly to a man who had been married to 3 petite women. Furthermore, she suffered from excessive body odor, according to the king. For a man who had spent his life chasing skirts, Henry should have had no trouble fulfilling his duty for the throne. Given that he never let marriage keep him from his mistresses, he wouldn't have needed to be with Anne exclusively, only until she conceived. The challenge seemed to lie in the stark difference between what Henry had hoped for and what he received, a gap that proved insurmountable. Each night, as he lay next to his wife, Henry likely prayed that his lawyers would find a way to annul the marriage. He delayed Anne's coronation, initially planned for February. In March, he took steps to renew his alliance with the French king, easing some of the pressure from the looming Austrian-Hungarian-French alliance. However, the true break in the marriage came in April, when Catherine Howard, the 15-year-old cousin of Anne and Mary Boleyn, caught his eye. Thomas Howard, the out-of-favor Duke, saw yet another opportunity to prostitute a family member in order to elevate his own status. Armed with a playbook that included all the tricks of a former mistress, as well as his second wife, Catherine moved in for the kill. She ignored his advanced age, sat with him on days when he could hardly walk, and kept silent about the king's leg wound, which continually oozed pus. Although Catherine tried to keep it hidden from the king, she had already been sexually active, and despite her best efforts to remain chaste until marriage, it's likely that she satisfied Henry in ways Anne of Cleves had never been able to. In June, Thomas Cromwell, the architect behind the king's 4th marriage, was arrested and sent to the Tower for a show trial. Few mourned his fate, as he was charged beneath the same statues he had once used to send innocents like Anne Boleyn to their deaths. His execution was painful. He required 2 strokes to sever his neck when the executioner bungled the task. While Cromwell pleaded for his life, Parliament heard the king's case for the annulment of his marriage. The king put forth 3 arguments. First, that Anne had allegedly been previously promised to another man through a premarital contract. Second, that he had been misled into the marriage and therefore his consent had not been valid. And third, that the lack of consummation for 4 months made the marriage irreparable in his eyes. Parliament sided with the king, clearing the way for Henry to reach a peaceful resolution with Anne. To the surprise of the court, the queen responded with remarkable grace. She accepted Henry's first offer, which included a £4,000 annuity, 3 castles, and the honor of becoming the king's honorary sister. The public declaration of her virginity, combined with the generous settlement, would allow her to remarry if she chose to do so. We can only speculate as to why Anne accepted the king's decision so readily. Perhaps she feared the same fate as Catherine, exiled and forgotten, or the gruesome end that befell Anne Boleyn. It could also be that after 4 months of sharing a bed with Henry, she came to realize that happiness would never be found between them. Whatever her reasons, she dutifully complied to the king's request to write to her brother, explaining that, rather than remaining his wife, she had become the king's sister, assuring him that she was content in her new life. Weir provides some insight into Henry's thinking, writing that after his 9-year battle with Catherine of Aragon over the validity of their marriage, he found it hard to believe that Anne had capitulated without any kind of fight. Whether it was due to her body odor, her pointed nose, or the lingering bitterness from her first marriage, Anne never sought to remarry, choosing instead to live out the rest of her days as a wealthy Englishwoman. She had, however, come to know Henry's children and developed a warm relationship with Elizabeth. Lacking children of her own, Anne found some solace in the young princess, while Elizabeth, in turn, received her first kind and nurturing adult female figure. Dr. Tracy Borman reveals to us that the two quickly struck up an indelible bond that would last the rest of their lives. The historian suspects that Elizabeth was inspired by Anne's example as an unmarried woman, successfully making her way through society, despite the fact that single women in Tudor society were compared to apes in hell, dragged along by the devils. The historical record is unclear regarding Catherine Howard's exact age, with estimates ranging from 15 to 21 years old. Assuming she was a teenager, she would have fit in seamlessly with many of her modern-day peers. Henry famously referred to his young bride as the rose without a thorn, but this idealization proved false, as her past would eventually come back to haunt her. The couple wed in secret and spent the next 10 days on their private honeymoon. Behind closed doors, she played the role of the dutiful wife, despite the significant age gap, Henry's obesity, and the constant need to change the bandages that soaked up the pus oozing from his leg. Anne's hasty departure left little time to properly assess the young woman who had captivated the king's attention. The Howard family faced severe financial hardship during Catherine's childhood. Historian Anne Foster notes that as one of the youngest of the 11 siblings, she'd grown up as an afterthought to an afterthought. Had she managed to wrangle a medium wealthy aristocrat, it would have been seen as a great success for her and her family. Coming from the lower classes, Catherine had no experience or guidance for what it meant to be Queen of England, with Foster informing us that Catherine's role models were slightly older girls who she saw routinely allowing men, both other wards and servants, to enter their rooms at night. These girls, she would have seen, were presented with gifts from their various suitors, setting up her understanding of the connection between beauty, sex, and economy. Despite the near-empty state of the royal treasury, Henry showered his bride with lavish gifts, after which he begged poverty as the reason that he never officially crowned the queen regent. This meant that he often repurposed jewels originally given to his previous 4 wives. It wasn't the only hand-me-down, though, as she also inherited the lands and manors once granted to the nearly departed Queen Jane. Weir reveals to us the young woman delighted in the confines of her new luxurious life. Every day she wore new gowns and appeared laden with the jewelry with which Henry had showered her. He had rarely been so extravagant with his previous wives. Each day, Catherine discovered some new caprice, and her greed earned her the disapproval of many of the older people at court. By the time she realized she needed saving, there were few who were willing to vouch for her. The king and his young bride dedicated themselves to the task of conceiving an heir, spending every night together for months. Their failure to conceive led to rumors that Henry could no longer father a child. However, it wasn't due to the lack of trying. Henry seemed imbued with a more youthful energy, which he used to keep up with a wife who was seen by the court as a frivolous, empty-headed girl, obsessed with dancing and fine clothes. His day began at 5 a.m. with mass at 7 and hawking until lunch, or as it was known in Tudor times, dinner. If you're wondering how Henry came to be so obese, the timing of his meals provided a clue. As the website Tastes of History points out, dinner could mark the start of a feast that lasted all day, consisting of 2 or even 3 courses with numerous dishes. His mood, however, remained volatile. Some of his most notorious acts took place during this period of his life. Margaret Pole, a 68-year-old countess with a legitimate claim to the throne as one of the last Plantagenets, was one of his victims. Queen Catherine had initially persuaded Henry to release her from 2 years of imprisonment, but after unrelated rebellion broke out, Henry reversed his decision and ordered her execution on the Tower Green. The website Real British Ghosts describes the scene for us, teaching that they expected her to say a few words before quietly laying her head upon the block. A hush fell over those assembled as she turned to the executioner. Was she going to say that she forgave the king? No, far from it. The countess told him that she was not going to lay her head upon the block, and if he wanted to strike it from her body, then he would have to do it where she stood. There was a moment's hesitation. Then a couple of guards roughly grabbed her and forced her to kneel with her head on the block. The poor headsman was, quite literally, put off his stroke. He swung his axe, but instead of hitting her neck, he struck her shoulder. Lady Pole jumped up and ran screaming around the scaffold. With blood pouring from the gash and into her white hair, the executioner chased her, wildly swinging his axe. He eventually cut down and killed her, although it took 11 bloody blows. Catherine Howard similarly struggled in her role as stepmother. She was 9 years younger than Mary, who at 24 must have been wondering when it would finally be her turn to marry. The 7-year-old Elizabeth, however, bonded well with her mother's cousin. Catherine often seated the young girl beside her during public meals, officially signaling her as a member of the royal bloodline. It was a position of honor, one that Elizabeth had never known before. The absence of a pregnancy was the only noticeable issue, but trouble soon arrived in the form of Francis Derham. Threatening to expose secrets from the Queen's past, he wormed his way into her court, having cashed in on a lucrative connection. Derham didn't retreat into the shadows, but instead alienated Catherine's maids, even going as far as to threaten them when they complained about his rude behavior. Though questions arose about his sudden presence, the full picture didn't emerge until a Protestant man confided in the Archbishop, revealing that the Queen was not the virtuous young woman she had portrayed herself to be. It was soon revealed to the Archbishop that she had been sexually active prior to her wedding night. This, in and of itself, wasn't a crime, but it would have been expected to have been revealed to the king before the wedding. The fact that she had hidden it from her husband suggested to the court that she was more likely to conduct another affair later in life. That is, of course, a logical fallacy, but such wouldn't matter if the majority of the king's confidants believe it to be true. A simple conversation likely would have been enough to clear the air, but the Archbishop was staunchly opposed to Queen Catherine on account that she was supported by a strong Catholic faction. Her removal was considered a move further entrench Protestantism in England. The Archbishop took several days to mull over the situation, crafting the argument that could finally sever the king's marriage. Weir points out that Cranmer, the Archbishop, was treading on very dangerous ground. Anne Boleyn's fall had come about because the king was desperate to be rid of her. He was deeply in love with Catherine and likely to react violently to any interference that she was not as virtuous as he believed her to be. Receiving permission to investigate, Cranmer found that as a youthful girl of about 13, she had been in love with her 36-year-old music teacher. Despite never having intimate relations, the two had made a pact to someday marry. Although it was likely just pillow talk, the Tudors viewed this as a potentially binding verbal marriage contract. In the event that the Queen bore a son, the king's enemies might claim the child was a bastard, using the argument that Henry's marriage was voided by the existence of a prior marriage contract. Although this was harmful in itself, it would merely result in the annulment of Catherine's marriage. Cranmer's investigation revealed even more damning information. Remember the earlier mention of her childhood role models? Older girls who traded sexual favors for gifts? It seems she had broken off her affair with her music teacher to begin a relationship with Francis Derham, the very man now employed in her private chambers in an undisclosed role. Francis, it was revealed, had snuck into Catherine's dormitory more than 100 times while she was at school. Their relationship was consummated, and numerous dormitory witnesses testified that they often had to relocate their beds as far from Catherine's as they could to get a decent night's sleep. Not only had Catherine kept her sexual history hidden from the king, letting him believe she had been a maid on their wedding night, but the man she had given her virginity to was now employed in her service. Cranmer, intent on seeing the queen removed, kept her from contacting Henry, fearing the man's resolve might weaken if left to his own devices. Weir notes that Bishop Cranmer was not a cruel man. He was determined that the queen should be sacrificed in the cause of reform. If she was allowed to live, there was always the possibility that the king might relent and take her back. It was therefore imperative that a charge of adultery be brought against Catherine, even though there was yet no evidence of it. To uncover the full extent of the deception, they employed torture. The music instructor readily confessed to fondling her, but refused to acknowledge any verbal marriage contract. He was released. Then, a maid testified to a secret, private meeting arranged for her in one of her lady's chambers. Another maid recalled an evening when she and her lady were alone, an uncommon situation with the door locked. On that night, When the king arrived to be with his wife, it took an uncomfortable delay before anyone was ready to unlock the door. By now, the investigators had little doubt that an affair was being covered up, with the leading suspect being her cousin, Thomas Culpeper, a noble on the King's Privy Council. Weir reveals that Catherine had not only been playing with fire, but she had also been indiscreet about it, and incredibly stupid. The council now wasted no time in searching through Culpeper's effects and found a letter signed by the Queen, and appallingly spelt, for she was barely literate, which confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect, that she had, indeed, been conducting a love affair with her cousin. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that execution was the only course Henry could take. Weir tells us that the king was so distressed that he burst into tears, regretting his ill luck in meeting such ill-conditioned wives and blaming the council for the last mischief. He had never been so miserable in his life. Apart from the wound to his heart, there was the wound to his pride. He had been made to look a fool. Culpeper was executed first, beheaded in a single stroke, despite being denied a headsman's block. Derham, lacking noble status, faced a traitor's death, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. The Howard family was then rounded up for their role in allowing the Viper so close to His Majesty's chest, losing everything but their lives. At least this allowed the king to somewhat replenish England's drained coffers. Accepting her fate, Catherine approached it with the intention of, as she put it, making a good death and leaving a good opinion in people's minds. True to her words, she rested her head on the block with grace, awaiting the single stroke that would sever her auburn head. Her accomplice, Lady Rochford, however, lost all composure as she was walked past the Queen's bloody remains, which were being draped in a black blanket. Catherine Howard was buried next to her cousin, Anne Boleyn, who, like Catherine, had sought to elevate her position by marrying Henry VIII. Both women shared a grisly fate, and the parallels between their lives must not have been lost on Elizabeth. Moreover, Catherine had been a friend to Elizabeth, once again elevating her within the eyes of her all-powerful father. Historian Jessica Carey Bunning notes that in 1566, the French ambassador wrote that Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's favorite and childhood friend, recalled that she had said, since she was 8 years old, that she would never marry. This vow coincided with the time of Catherine Howard's arrest and execution, suggesting the tragic event had a lasting influence on her. Catherine's death, as both a cousin and a stepmother, likely shaped Elizabeth's future decision to remain unmarried, solidifying her identity as the Virgin Queen. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, is often remembered as the luckiest unlucky woman in history. King Henry wasn't the first decrepit old man she had to guide to the grave. Born into the upper echelons of high nobility, Catherine's personal desires were constantly suppressed in favor of her family's interests. At just 14, she was forced to marry a 63-year-old lord, but the marriage lasted only 2 years, leaving her with 3 stepchildren, all older than she. A widow at 16, she next married a lord in his late 30s. While the age gap was more appropriate, it had to be noted that her new husband had previously been married twice before. Having just executed another wife, the king didn't rush into the constraints of marriage right away. One ambassador described Henry re-entering his bachelor phase of life, with Sunday being devoted to the lords of his council, Monday to the men of the law, and Tuesday to the ladies. The obese king was enjoying himself, but worried that the many ladies of the court who were willing to entertain him during his grieving period weren't virtuous enough to be wife material. In their own defense, the ladies of the court knew that accepting the crown was fraught with peril, for it was said in the halls of Windsor that the king either putteth away or killeth his wives. Rather than seeking another marriage for himself, Henry began arranging unions for his children. At 24, Mary, his eldest daughter, was already past her prime for marriage. He initially attempted to secure a match for her with the French king's son, but the on-again, off-again relationship soured once more. For Edward, his heir, he sought to unite England with Scotland through a marriage to the infant Queen Mary of Scots. With her father recently deceased after England's victory at Solway Moss, such a union would have solidified Henry's legacy. Once again, however, Henry's past interfered, as the Scottish royals refused to send their daughters to be raised by the Tudors. In response to this rejection, Henry ravaged the Scottish Highlands, ultimately forcing the young queen to be sent to France, where she was raised as England's enemy. Before he could turn his attention to finding an eligible suitor for Elizabeth, however, he was distracted by Catherine Parr. She wasn't attempting to attract the king's attention. In fact, she was likely completely oblivious to the fact that she was being watched at all. Her second husband was on his deathbed, but that didn't stop the king from sending lavish gifts, signaling his willingness to comfort her during her time of need. While she appreciated the king's well wishes, it was another powerful man at the court who caught her eye for her third marriage. At 31, now a woman of means, she had resolved that at this time she would have a say in who she married. Sir Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane, was the object of her interest. Henry had long harbored an intense fondness for the family of the women who had given him his only male heir. Thomas's brother was the head of the king's privy council, and the other family members held powerful positions across the country. Although Thomas was wealthy, powerful, and attractive, he was often depicted as being dumb as a box of rocks. However, after her previous two husbands, Catherine was willing to put up with the dull conversations in order to enjoy the feel of his muscles. Focused on Thomas Seymour, Catherine remained completely unaware of the king's own desires and the jealousy that was quickly consuming him. Tensions came to head when Catherine's brother accused his own wife of infidelity, a charge that carried the death penalty for high nobility. Determined to save her sister-in-law from the headsman, Catherine personally intervened with the king, throwing herself at his feet and refusing to rise until he promised to spare her. Henry granted her request on the condition that she convince her brother to back down. With Catherine now indebted to him, Henry started promoting the relatives of the woman who had captured his attention. This was a time-honored custom and left little room for doubt about his expectations. Weir writes that this alone should have warned Catherine that the king's intentions were serious, but she either did not notice or was too affected to ignore the fact, being too involved emotionally with Seymour. Henry saw this and was jealous. Seymour was a younger man who epitomized many of the things Henry had been in his youth, and this in itself did not exactly endear him to his sovereign. Henry wanted her, and Henry meant to have her. When he finally advanced through intermediaries, she politely refused, stating for the record that she had no desire to be the Queen of England. Recognizing Seymour as a potential obstacle, the king dispatched him on the permanent assignment as an ambassador to the regent of the Netherlands in Brussels. Although their relationship had remained innocent, Thomas and Catherine had confided in one another about their hopes to marry in the future. With him now across the English Channel, however, a reunion seemed distant and uncertain. Her lack of fortune and love persisted as the king made his intentions to marry her plain. Convinced she had no way to refuse such an influential man, she finally gave in. This was despite the fact that one eyewitness described Henry as being so fat that such a man had never been seen. 3 of the biggest men that could be found could get into his doublet. Weir reminds us that she was more suited than most for the task facing her, having been once married to an old man and having nursed another through his final illness. She was steady and she was sensible, and having had the care of grown stepchildren before, all of whom seemed to have got on well with her, she was uniquely fit for the role of stepmother to the king's 3 children, whose interests she would protect with her customary efficiency. There was only one major problem, for the final wife of Henry VIII was secretly a Lutheran. Henry insisted that his Church of England remained Catholic, despite creating it to bypass the Pope's authority. Several key moments highlight the lengths he went to maintain this claim. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was a strong advocate for the Protestant reforms, but wasn't allowed to implement most of them, while his fourth wife, Anne of Cleaves, was forced to convert to Catholicism, even though the marriage was intentionally intended to align England with a Lutheran nation. Catherine Parr, a closeted Lutheran, was far more intelligent than any of Henry's previous wives, fully aware of the dangerous game she played. While she subtly nudged the king towards Protestantism, she remained silent as he continued to burn heretics at the stake. Playing the long game, she bided her time. As queen, Catherine published 2 books, with her first release making a groundbreaking moment. It was the first time a Queen of England had ever shared her personal views directly with her subjects. Catherine Parr, one of the sharpest minds in England, seized control of her stepchildren's education, particularly focusing on Edward. She brought in a tutor who rewrote the curriculum to ensure that Edward received a curriculum that pushed him to consider the theological issues surrounding Luther's challenge to the Catholic faith. At Catherine's insistence, Elizabeth was allowed to join the class. The young princess, already fluent in several languages by the age of 10, was praised for her intellect and deep understanding of the classics. When their tutor took class breaks, Elizabeth would diligently take out her lute for practice or begin some needlework. Catherine also lovingly encouraged Mary to publish her own academic work, something that had been unheard of for a lady of her stature. Weir reveals that the children's new stepmother was a very welcome presence in their lives, especially to Elizabeth, who had for most of her young life lacked a mother's love and guidance. The king had never felt comfortable in the company of Anne Boleyn's academically advanced daughter, but now, under Catherine Parr's benign influence, he softened and unbent towards her. Catherine had won over her husband, the royal court, and the country. When Henry left for skirmishes with France, she was appointed regent. In his absence, her husband convened Parliament to once again adjust the official order of succession, placing her unborn children ahead of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Catherine had managed to transform yet another politically inconvenient marriage into one where she could find fulfillment in helping others. Catherine's carefully crafted life had only two potential threats. The first was Thomas Seymour, the man she had tried to forget when Henry sent him off to the Netherlands. Upon his return, however, Henry appointed Seymour as Lord High Admiral of England, despite his lack of qualifications. The assumption would be that in his new position, the Queen's former flame be away for extended periods at sea. The second person who could undo everything Catherine had worked for was Anne Askew, a Lutheran arrested for hearsay and imprisoned in the Tower of London. In a confession, Askew named Queen Catherine as a Protestant. Weir tells us that it is hardly likely that Catherine was unaware of the danger in which she stood, yet she refused to be intimidated. She knew very well that several persons in her inner circle were Protestant converts, and she also knew that heretics risked a dreadful penalty. She realized, therefore, she should proceed with utmost care. She had seen the king's love could easily turn to hatred, and she did not imagine that he would react kindly to the news that his wife was a secret Protestant. The real danger for Catherine lay in the fractured court of Henry VIII, where factions vied for power. The fall of the Queen became a political opportunity for those seeking to place their own supporters on the throne, and it was Lord Chancellor Wriothesley who sought to ensure that Catherine's end would be as grim as those of the other two Catherines who had been Henry's wives. The Lord Chancellor's efforts bore fruit when he gathered enough evidence to pressure the king into allowing an investigation. A fortunate slip of fate saw Catherine's arrest warrant fall into the hands of a Privy Council member, and a loyal follower rushed to deliver it to the Queen, whose cries reverberated throughout the castle. Henry, unaware that Catherine was already partly aware of the unfolding events, hurried to comfort her. In past instances, the king had been carefully kept from his wives, while others plotted their downfalls, for fear that Henry would be too weak to act decisively in the presence of a sobbing woman. The young queen's tears initially stayed his hand, but heeding the warning, Catherine changed her course. She decided to cease interfering in religious matters and forbade those around her from dabbling in hearsay. She adopted the role of the perfect wife to the king, who was also the head of the church. This was no difficult ruse for her. Despite her intellectual pursuits, she firmly believed in the Bible's teachings that a woman should be subservient to her husband. Aware of the investigation unfolding behind the scenes, Henry spent the following day probing Catherine, testing his advisor's theory that she might secretly be a heretic. She confessed that her earlier challenges to the king's doctrine had merely been for the sake of conversation, not because she believed any reform was necessary. Publicly declaring this to the assembled court before passionately kissing the king sealed her fate. It was only moments later that the Lord Chancellor appeared, leading 40 knights and carrying the arrest warrant, one that the Queen had quietly arranged to be returned to the careless messenger who had dropped it. Despite the document bearing Henry's signature, the king erupted in anger at the intrusion, publicly scolding the chancellor before the court. As the next year rolled on, life settled into its usual patterns. Henry dispatched the Lord Admiral to France, Catherine continued her work with Henry's children, and in the shadows, conspirators schemed to replace her. One such plot involved the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, the ambitious uncle of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Shortly after deciding to send his former Lord Chancellor to the Tower to spend Christmas in chains, the king passed away. He thanked God for the happy successes of his reign and expressed gratitude that, despite so many changes, he had been fortunate enough to die in the arms of such a faithful spouse. He then requested that his daughter Mary be a kind and loving mother to her brother Edward, whom he described as a little helpless child. With death drawing near, Henry wrote one final letter to his old rival, the King of France, who was also on his deathbed from syphilis. In his farewell, Henry reminded the French king of the inevitability of mortality. Edward was with Elizabeth when he received the news that he was now king. The moment was a bittersweet one. Though he had always known this day might come, the weight of the crown was heavier than he had imagined. Elizabeth, ever the supportive sister, offered a quiet but reassuring presence as Edward processed the news, the enormity of the responsibility sinking in. Given that the king was only 9 years old, a regency council was established to govern the realm. Thomas Seymour's brother was chosen as Lord Protector, taking the reins of power. Despite being the regent's brother, the king's uncle and the Lord Admiral of the Seas, Thomas, found himself excluded from the administration. Fueled by ambition, he grew eager to outshine his influential brother and set his sights on a marriage proposal to Elizabeth, hoping to further elevate his status. The 13-year-old princess firmly rejected Thomas Seymour's proposal, stating that neither my age nor my inclination allows me to think of marriage. Seymour never considered courting her older sister Mary due to her staunch Catholic beliefs. Instead, he turned his attention to his former flame, Catherine Parr. Now a queen dowager, she held little power in her own right. But her close connection to the young king and his sisters provided an opportunity for Seymour to bypass his brother's regency council and approach the king directly. After being rejected by the king's sister, he proceeded to ask Edward for permission to marry Catherine Parr. It was just a month after the death of the boy's father. The Privy Council would have undoubtedly refused, as a quick pregnancy could raise suspicions that the child was fathered by Henry before his death. A 9-year-old boy, however, only saw an opportunity to make his beloved stepmother happy and gave his permission. The two wed in secret. For the first time, Catherine married the man she wanted. It quickly proved to be a monumental mistake. Distracted by his charms, she overlooked several signs that her new husband was merely using her. At her new husband's request, Catherine invited her stepdaughter Elizabeth to stay with them. Neither the girl nor Thomas mentioned his previous attempts to court her. Though the term didn't exist at the time, it's clear that Thomas Seymour had begun the process of grooming Elizabeth. He often snuck into her bedroom early in the morning while she was still in her pajamas and tickled her beneath the covers. He claimed it was harmless, even repeating the behavior in front of Catherine and the household staff to normalize it. As was customary for ladies of high nobility, Elizabeth was never truly alone, with a maid always nearby to ensure the tickling didn't go too far. One of the clearest signs of Thomas Seymour's intentions was that on the morning when Elizabeth had already risen and dressed, he would appear in the doorway and then leave without any physical contact. His playful routine only took place when she was still in her sleepwear and in her bed. I am in no way suggesting that a 13-year-old groomed by a 40-year-old man is to blame for what happened. However, the historical record does indicate that Elizabeth, confused and inexperienced, may have inadvertently invited some of the attention from the highly sought-after lord. Seymour's long-term plan was to marry his niece, Lady Jane Grey, to King Edward, while securing the king's sister, Elizabeth, for himself, positioning himself as the chief influence in the young monarch's ear. That plan came to a screeching halt in March of 1548, when Catherine finally conceived her first child. With his wife distracted by the glow of motherhood, Thomas intensified his pursuit of Elizabeth, only to be ensnarled in a lie. After Thomas was caught by a witness, he confessed to Catherine that Elizabeth was having an affair with a servant. Catherine confronted Elizabeth immediately, warning her of the dangers of scandal. Elizabeth's tearful denial left Catherine uncertain. Either her stepdaughter was lying, or her husband was. Catherine Parr wasn't blameless in this situation, but she had been naive. One of the more troubling accounts of how Seymour manipulated Elizabeth involved Catherine herself. The three of them had been playing in the gardens, chasing each other and wrestling, until Thomas, in a strange display of good fun, had cut the girl's dress off while the queen held her down, laughing. What had seemed innocent at the time now felt very different in Catherine's mind. When she later discovered that both of them were unaccounted for, the heavily pregnant queen took matters into her own hands, searching the house. It was then that she found them, locked in an embrace, kissing passionately. Historical accounts often suggest that Catherine sided with her philandering husband, chastising Elizabeth for her actions and ultimately banishing her from the house. The queen, likely driven by a sense of loyalty to her new husband and the desire to maintain peace in her own home, chose to take his side, though it must have weighed heavily on her. She did indeed send Elizabeth away, but it was done for the girl's own safety and well-being, protecting her from the one man she had chosen to marry. Pregnant with her husband's child, Catherine was torn, unsure how much blame to lay on Thomas and how much with Elizabeth, who had seemingly been willing to indulge him. After all, a simple conversation along the lines of, "Hey, did you know that your new husband asked me to marry him before he chose you?" would have prevented Elizabeth from being invited to stay with them. In a painful last interview with her stepdaughter, Catherine told her that God has given you great qualities. Cultivate them always and labor to improve them. For I believe you are destined by heaven to be Queen of England. Weir notes that Elizabeth kissed her and was gone, unable to beat Catherine's coldness. It would be the last conversation they had, as Catherine Parr died shortly after giving birth to her own child, a daughter whom she named Mary. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contact EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.